Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Tax Talk webinar. I'm Tricia, your host for today, and I'm a member of the KDP University team. Tax season in the U.S. comes around once a year, and if you're eligible, KDP sends an email letting you know that your end-of-the-year tax forms are ready. But unless you're a tax professional, you may have some questions. KDP customer service is not able to give tax advice or give instructions on how you should complete the tax interview. We are able to provide help finding the information you may need to complete the tax interview. And since your tax status is unique, you may need to meet with a tax professional to help you answer your specific questions. So if I can't advise you how to complete the tax interview or give you tax advice, what are we doing here today? Today, I'm going to give some general tax information, outline some common scenarios, and define some of the less common terms featured in the tax interview. We'll be covering information about why Amazon needs your tax information, discuss how to download your end-of-the-year tax forms for the sales that you earned in the U.S. marketplaces, give an overview of the tax interview, and discuss some terms that you may not be familiar with. Some of you may have had a CreateSpace account last year and have moved over to KDP. If you reside in the U.S., in most cases, we have combined your forms. So you'll just have the one form that can be downloaded from your KDP account. Now, if your tax status changed when your account moved to KDP, or you reside outside the U.S., you may have both a CreateSpace and a KDP form for 2018 royalties. Both forms can be downloaded from your KDP account. The first question we usually get is, why do I need to provide my tax information to Amazon? Since Amazon is a US-based company, we require all authors and publishers, including nonprofit or tax-exempt organizations, to provide valid taxpayer identification in order to comply with U.S. tax reporting regulations. This is true for all KDP authors and publishers, regardless of where you live. By default, KDP authors sell on the U.S. Amazon Marketplace, and from those sales, you're paid royalties. These royalties are considered income by the U.S. Taxing Authority, or IRS. Since U.S. tax regulations require Amazon to collect information about authors and publishers' tax status under U.S. law, the tax interview helps you submit your tax information during the account setup for KDP. The interview guides you through a step-by-step process and gathers all necessary information required to establish your tax identity and generate a Form W-9 for either U.S. authors and publishers or a Form W-8 for non-U.S. authors and publishers. For each tax interview question, there's a light blue lowercase I in a circle. You can hover over this icon to see more information. This information will help provide additional information that you may find helpful when answering your questions. Just because you've completed the tax interview during your account setup, there are some scenarios where you would need to retake the tax interview. Some authors and publishers will receive emailed notification to retake the tax interview if they're located outside the U.S. and took the interview 4 years ago, or if there was information provided that did not match what the IRS has on file. You also need to retake the tax interview if you have a life change. This includes, but is not limited to, the address changes, your name changes, or you change your business status. As a reminder, you'll need to make these changes in your account setup prior to retaking the tax interview. If any of these changes occur during the tax year, your end-of-the-year tax form will be completed with the most recent tax interview entries. As part of the reporting process, Amazon provides end-of-the-year tax forms during the first quarter of the calendar year for content providers that have met certain conditions. If you're like me and you try to do your taxes as early as possible, you don't need to wait for the forms to be mailed out. The forms will be available for download from your KDP account, and if you would like, you can have your tax forms still mailed to you. We're going to watch a video that demonstrates how to download your end-of-the-year tax forms from your KDP account. You're a content provider and you're preparing for tax season. At the beginning of every year, Amazon issues tax forms required by the U.S. taxing authority called the Internal Revenue Service, or IRS. If you're a U.S. author or publisher who's earned more than $10 in U.S. royalties during the calendar year, we'll issue Form 1099 MISC yearly on or before January 31st. If you're an author or publisher who resides outside the U.S. and were paid more than 49 cents in U.S. source royalties last year, we'll issue Form 1042S yearly on or before March 15th. Just keep in mind, reportable payments are rounded to the nearest whole dollar. So how do you know your tax forms are ready? We'll send you an email to the email address on your account. This email lets you know that the tax forms are available for download and includes instructions on how to access the forms. If you're a U.S. publisher with multiple independent publishing accounts, wherever possible, your reportable royalties will be consolidated on one form. You only need to access one account and download one form, since all the forms are the same. If you're outside the U.S., you'll need to download a form for each business. To access your forms through your account, sign into your KDP account and then click on Your Name's Account at the top. Click Tax Information on the left-hand side, then View Provide Tax Information. If you haven't already, you can choose to go paperless by clicking the yellow Go Paperless button. Once we've notified you your tax forms are available, you can click Find Forms. It may take a few moments to pull up your forms. When they appear, click the download link. This will open up your form as a PDF. From there, you can save it to your computer or you can print it. If you don't have any tax forms, or they aren't available yet, you'll see a message explaining this when you click the Find Forms button. Some common reasons include the forms have not yet been posted, your account did not receive at least $10 in royalties during the calendar year, or your account is exempt from 1099 reporting based on your interview inputs. If you opted for paper delivery, the forms are mailed on or before the dates listed. Depending on where you live, forms may take up to 2 weeks to arrive. Regardless of your delivery preference, you'll be able to access your tax forms online once they're available. Remember that KDP is not able to provide you with any tax advice, including what to do with your tax forms when they arrive. If you have questions about how to file your taxes, we recommend you consult a qualified tax professional. Let's talk for a moment about how the tax interview is set up. The tax interview is set up to ask specific questions, and these questions will guide you so that you can provide answers that will correctly determine your tax withholding and reporting to the IRS. This means that based on your answers to each of the questions, the tax interview may change. For example, you'll need to answer different questions if you're an independent author or publisher than you would if you're submitting content as a business or a nonprofit. Once you answer and submit the answers to key questions, the interview questions may change. Your completed interview is going to determine if and how much money will be withheld from each of your sales in the U.S. marketplace. Even if you live outside the U.S., as long as you are selling products in the U.S. marketplace, you may be required to pay taxes or be subject to a 30% tax withholding. Now, even though everyone with a KDP account is required to complete the tax interview, not everyone living outside the U.S. is required to pay taxes. Many countries have treaties with the U.S. and may be eligible for treaty benefits. Based on the treaty with your country of residence, or where you spend most of your time, and the U.S., you may not have taxes withheld. So how would you know if your country has a treaty with the U.S.? The U.S. Tax Authority, or IRS, has a website. This website lists all the countries that have treaties with the U.S. You can access information for your country of residence by going to www.irs.gov. Later, you'll have the opportunity to download a companion which contains links to the IRS website. My Social Security number is considered my tax identification number, or TIN. Examples of TINs are Social Security numbers, individual tax identification numbers, or ITINs, and employee identification numbers, or EINs, for business. If you're outside the U.S., you'll need a TIN or an ITIN to show that your country has a tax treaty with the U.S. Now, some countries have their own TINs that you can use when completing the tax interview. Or if your country does not use TINs, you can apply for a U.S. TIN on the IRS website. If your country doesn't have a tax identification number, you can apply for a U.S. individual tax identification number or an employee identification number if you're a business. You can apply by contacting the IRS by mail, but keep in mind that it can take up to 7 weeks to complete this process once your application has been submitted. We've included a link to the IRS website in the companion if you need additional assistance. If you complete the interview without a TIN, or if your country does not have a treaty with the U.S., that will automatically mean that the U.S. tax withholding will default to 30%. You need to supply the TIN to be eligible for a reduction in tax withholdings based on your country's treaty with the U.S. And if your country doesn't have a treaty with the U.S., you will be subject to the 30% tax withholding. Let's talk about some of the different terms that you may encounter when you're completing the tax interview. When you're determining if you're a U.S. citizen, or if you should complete the interview as a U.S. citizen, there's a section called the U.S. Persons Test for an individual. If you live outside the U.S. or reside in the U.S. but are citizens of a non-U.S. country, you may be considered a U.S. person for tax purposes. The U.S. Persons Test asks questions to help you determine if you meet any criteria that would consider you a U.S. person for tax purposes. If you have a green card or have lived and worked in the U.S. for a certain amount of time, you may be considered a U.S. citizen for the purpose of tax reporting. For more clarification about this section of the interview, there's a link in the companion document from today's webinar that will take you to the Substantial Presence Test on the IRS website. In the international portion of the tax interview, there's a question about whether or not you're a beneficial owner. So, what exactly is a beneficial owner? The beneficial owner is the person or entity who benefits from the payments. When you're completing the interview, ask yourself, who ultimately receives the royalties? Is it you or is it someone else? Another question that you may encounter in the tax interview that you're not familiar with is, are you an agent acting as an intermediary? An agent acting as an intermediary is a person or company that's acting on behalf of another individual or group of individuals. A partnership, a trust, or other flow-through entities may fall under this category. If you have a question about if this applies to you, please reach out to a tax professional. There's also a question about effectively connected income. Effectively connected income means that you have business payments that are connected to the U.S. It may mean that you have a physical presence in the U.S. More than likely, if this applies to you, you would be registered with the U.S. and have a tax ID. Now, just because you're selling your books on Amazon's U.S. marketplace, this doesn't mean that you would answer yes to this question. Unless your business has a physical location in the U.S., you probably don't have effectively connected income. And if you have additional questions about if this applies to your situation, there are some examples on the IRS website. Once you complete the tax interview section, there's an area for your signature. If you'd like to submit the form with a digital signature, all you need to do is type your name in the box and acknowledge that you're submitting the form with a digital signature. If you don't want to sign the tax interview digitally, you can print out the form and mail it to Amazon. Keep in mind, it can take several days for the form to be processed once it's received by Amazon. Thank you for joining us today for the Tax Talk webinar. As a reminder, we'll be posting a recording of the webinar on KDP University's YouTube channel, and we'll also open a page on the KDP University help pages that includes FAQs from today's webinar. As always, happy publishing!